it's Joe Pardavila. You are listening to the Forbes Books Podcast. And if you're like me, you're hooked on Hollywood. You love movies, you subscribe to 8 streaming services and use only 2 of them, and you go see every Marvel movie when it comes out on opening weekend. But it turns out that Hollywood is hooked on China, specifically box office receipts from China. And my guest this week is the author of Red Carpet, Hollywood, China, and the Global Battle for Cultural Supremacy. His name is Erich Schwartzel. Erich has been reporting on the film industry for the Wall Street Journal since 2013, and he's uncovered a treasure trove of stories that give us a little insight on Hollywood's complicated relationship with China. Erich, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, I'm happy to be here.
So, Erich, my introduction to China's relationship to Hollywood was the remake of Red Dawn. As a Gen Xer, that was one of my all-time favorite films. I think it was on a loop on HBO. Red Dawn was, a story of the Soviet Union attacking the United States and a group of teenage rebels fighting off the Soviet Union, which is obviously a very realistic story. But the remake of Red Dawn, which happened several years ago, was the first time that I realized, China's really got a major hand to play in this. Talk to me about how that whole Red Dawn situation happened, where they basically had to change the entire storyline and the main antagonist of the film.
It's a fascinating bookend. And also, I have to say, you've just answered a question I've had, which is, the original Red Dawn comes up often in interviews for this book, and people have such an attachment to that movie. And I think it must have been one of those cable mainstays. It must have been just sort of like the HBO go-to for sick days and like late Friday nights for people of a certain generation, because it has really stuck around in a way that not a lot of movies do 30 or 40 years later. Anyway, it comes out in the mid 80s. It's this sort of like the ultimate emblem of Cold War cinema. As you said, the Soviets are the bad guys invading these nice, sleepy American towns. And these teenagers have to take up arms. In 2009, MGM wanted to remake the movie because even back then, they were trying to remake anything they could.
Right.
And they knew at the time, and this is ironic to talk about this week, they knew at the time that Russia as an invader made very little sense, and that no one would buy really any kind of country or sort of like stateless terrorist invasion of the U.S., except for China. China was a country that was big enough. It was growing. It was growing more aggressive on the world stage. It was a country that made sense as the sort of the rebooted enemy.
Right.
They put this movie into production. They hired 2 writers to work on it. They suture those 2 scripts into one, and they filmed the movie as it's a new Red Dawn. I mean, you should watch it. It's exactly what you think it is. It's about a group of teenagers who see these Chinese paratroopers land on their front lawns and overnight take over their town. But when Chinese authorities heard that this movie was being made, even before it came out and while it was still in production, they made it clear that this was going to be a problem. And the way they can often do this is they have state newspapers. They have several media outlets that are essentially mouthpieces of the government that people will read and parse to figure out what the government's stance on certain things are. And articles started to appear about this remake of the Red Dawn movie, again, that had not yet come out, and that most Chinese readers would have never heard of.
Right.
They start saying this is going to be a problem if this studio releases the film with China as the enemy. Now, MGM, when they put that movie into production, they were not thinking about China. It was still a relatively small box office market, and Red Dawn was not the kind of movie that would have typically played in China anyway. Even back then, the only movies that would be released in China and see any kind of revenue were things like Avatar, like really big budget Hollywood releases. Nonetheless, MGM had other concerns to consider because they did release other bigger movies. They did release James Bond films in China, and they knew that if they angered Chinese authorities over this Red Dawn remake, that they might not get those bigger movies, those more important films, into China as a result. And so they did something extraordinary. They pooled the film and they sent it to a company in Burbank that specializes in what they call hidden effects, which are I would say, let's say the more grounded, pragmatic special effects. So these are the folks who go in and I mean, we'll just go there. They airbrush pubic hair out of the frame
right.
if it's been caught. They make sure the boom mic isn't floating above the actor's head.
Right.
One guy told me that his job was to erase the back acne of the shirtless action star when he took his shirt off to show off all his muscles. I mean, when you think about it, these people have some pretty important jobs when it comes to making the movies work. And they were sent the film, and they had to go in and frame by frame change it from a Chinese invasion to a North Korean invasion. And that means changing every flag, the buttons on the military officers' jackets, every line of dialogue that referenced China had to become North Korea. And they ultimately released the film as a North Korean invasion of the U.S. And that Red Dawn reboot from 2009 remains the last movie put into production by a major Hollywood studio with China as the villain.
Wow. I mean, I remember when that happened. And also, sort of a footnote on that, the movie ended up bombing. It was actually a terrible remake.
Well, what's fascinating, too, is you're right. It was not a surprise. I mean, it was not a secret that MGM was doing this. I was struck when I went back and did a lot of the archival work that there wasn't more of a backlash. At the time, it was 2012, and really the only group that I could find who were upset by MGM's decision was this local militia in Michigan who said it was a cop-out. And I think that speaks to where the U.S. was with China at the time. It didn't seem like what MGM was doing was part of a broader rivalry or conflict.
Yeah, and the scary stuff that you uncover, like the meetings that Hollywood studios with Chinese officials, it really is. It's amazing how a lot of these so-called like Hollywood big shots sold their soul to China, and the fact of the small amounts of like they were playing the long game. You had a stat there where they were basically, I think Hollywood studios were only getting 20% of the gross from China or something like that, which in any business on the planet, no one would ever agree on something like that. But because these Hollywood behemoths were so obsessed with getting into China, they were signing these horrific deals with the Chinese government.
Well, a couple things were happening. And so one was that China's box office started to grow around really in a major way around 2008. And that is also the year that ticket sales in the U.S. started to flatline. And the only gains you saw in the U.S. box office were driven largely by inflation or higher ticket prices.
Right.
And so it was a growth market in an industry that frankly didn't really think there would be another growth market. I mean, the American movie had kind of saturated much of the world by the early 21st century. And so there was that growth, and then there were other revenue streams that started to collapse around the same time, primarily the DVD market. And it is, I mean, I think a little funny to remember now in the streaming age, but the DVDs used to be, it was a phenomenon. I read these articles at the time, Joe, about lines forming outside Walmart because Finding Nemo was being released on DVD. DVDs were so popular that Walmart would buy them at a loss because the foot traffic they generated made up the difference. And then to see that market collapse in favor of streaming meant that there was a huge financial hole that the studios had to fill. And so you're right, China had so much leverage that they were able to cut these rather lousy deals with studios. Initially, the studios only received 13%.
13. Oh, I gave too much credit. Yeah, that's right. 13%. Okay.
Well, what you were thinking of is they then negotiated in 2012 a new deal to get 25%.
Okay, got it.
And 25% is still about 15 percentage points lower than the international average. Wow. But I mean, this is one of the examples where I think Hollywood can empathize with a lot of different sectors where China, just by virtue of its scale, can demand terms that other countries' smaller markets can't.
Yeah, the DVD part of the book, I laugh because I remember as a person who just loved Hollywood and reading like Entertainment Weekly and Movie Line when those kind of magazines existed, you'd hear the quote of like a random studio executive, it didn't make much in the box office, but we'll make it back on DVD sales. And then once the DVD went away, we're like, oh boy, we got to find another revenue stream here somehow.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, it really kept the lights on, and a movie that just absolutely bombed could make it up in DVD sales. And I guess it makes sense, right? I mean, there's those things were what, 17, 19 bucks a
Yeah.
pop, and obviously not very expensive to manufacture.
And not only that, you had the blockbusters of the world buying hundreds of thousands of copies of these for people to rent. So you already had you were getting people buying it one way or the other, whether it was coming through the retail chain like a Walmart, or where you were renting it, and those big blockbuster videos were buying the videos. So that went away, and then they found China. One of the great parts of your book, and this was and I remember this movie vaguely, and I remember it because it was like it kind of came and went. And now reading about it in Red Carpet is the story of Kundun, Martin Scorsese's film about the Dalai Lama. So take us back to that time when the film comes out. Again, when it came out, it was dropped like it was like a tree in the forest. You barely even knew that movie existed, but there's a reason behind that, right, Eric?
Absolutely. It's a fascinating story. This is in the mid-90s. It's about 3 years after Hollywood movies have started flowing into China at all. The first Hollywood movies led into the country after the Cultural Revolution started to go there in 1994. At the time, China's economy was modernizing. There was certainly a sense that China was going to be a big market. No one knew how big. And there were already rumblings about China joining the WTO and maybe having a bigger role in the broader global economy. So in Hollywood, it put studios in a kind of weird position where they were like, well, we need to pay attention to this. We can't dedicate all of our resources to it, but it's something we should keep an eye on. And that was definitely the case at Disney, where executives knew that over the next 20 or 30 years, China was going to be a major market. And this was also a time when Disney itself was trying to expand internationally and diversify beyond its domestic holdings. So even back in the mid-90s, executives were traveling to China and laying the groundwork for conversations about a theme park on the mainland or trying to get toys into the country. And the one thing they really wanted was to get the Disney Channel into China because they knew that the Disney Channel was the best way to introduce young kids to Disney characters. Because if you introduce the kids to the characters, they start begging mom and dad to take them to the theme park and buy them the toys. So these conversations were happening as I said, in a relatively subtle but promising way when Kundun started production at Disney. It was a Martin Scorsese film about, and this is the kind of movie that Disney doesn't even really make anymore. It's an adult drama about a young Dalai Lama fleeing Tibet and Mao Zedong's invasion of Tibet. Obviously, history that China does not want to revisit and does not want to be told in any unsanctioned way. About 2 days after the movie started filming, a phone call came into the executive offices at Disney saying, "We understand you are making this movie." It was the Chinese embassy calling and saying that they would consider such a film an interference in China's internal affairs. And suddenly, all of that promise, the theme park, the Disney Channel, the toy sales, were jeopardized by the production of this film. And so it's really one of those fascinating examples because this was a movie very similar to the Red Dawn reboot many years later, where no one making the film thought it would ever play in China. It was not being made in China. It was not being made for Chinese audiences. It was just going to be shown primarily in the US. And yet, nonetheless, it kind of contaminated the entire corporate parent behind it and threatened much bigger revenue streams than just this one film's box office. So this put the Disney executive who got this call in a very confused and a very sensitive position because he knew that if they tried to kill the film, it was still early in the production, they could have done that. If they'd killed the film, they would have had backlash from people in Hollywood and from, friends of Scorsese. They didn't want to be seen as sort of muzzling the expression of a director like that. But they also knew that putting the movie out at all risked getting Disney kicked out of the country. So you're right. The decision they landed on was to bury the film. Kundun came out on Christmas Day, I believe in 1997, and it premiered on 2 screens. It was marketed as one of those platform releases. They'll expand from there, and eventually they did. But it did so poorly, and it was buried so deliberately that they were able to justify to Scorsese and others never really giving it a national release. And they thought that that would be the best solution, right? They could say to China, look, we can't cancel this film, but we're going to make sure it causes as little a stink as possible. Nonetheless, China did ban Disney from the country and kicked out all of its business, stopped its business overnight. And it wasn't until about a year later that the then CEO, Michael Eisner, flew to China and met with Chinese officials. And there is this absolutely fascinating transcript of one of these meetings where he says, the bad news is that we made the film. The good news is that nobody saw it. And he essentially apologizes for making the movie at all. Then suddenly Disney business starts flowing back into China.
Now, I'm curious. I'm glad you brought up that transcript, because when I was reading that in your book, I'm like, how the hell did Erich Schwartzel get this? Like, where did that come from?
The official that Michael Eisner was meeting with was a guy named Zhu Rongji, and he was a longtime Chinese Communist Party official. He was the mayor of Shanghai. He's really credited with helping modernize much of China's economy under Deng Xiaoping. And he also must have been just an incredible scrupulous note taker or archivist, because he published, I think, multiple books of just complete transcripts of meetings he had with executives, officials, all sorts of people. I have to imagine that the people in the room did not know that they were being recorded, because it's hard to imagine some of the things in that book being said, knowing that it might be published later. But I have to say, as an author, it was a goldmine.
Oh, God, yeah. I mean, I was shocked that you even had that, because it's so embarrassing that you're actually throwing, and I think you use this phrase in the book, like throwing Martin Scorsese under the bus. And I'm curious, now that this has come to light, even though people kind of had a feeling this is what Disney had done at the time, any word from the Scorsese camp or people around his circle that now this has become more publicly known?
You know what? It's interesting. Not really. It comes up a lot as one of those initial cautionary tales and one of those very public examples that taught everyone in Hollywood a lesson, because this was happening in public view. I'd say I don't think the Eisner transcript came out until years later, but people knew that Kundun was an issue and that Disney was facing pressure from China. I've not heard too much from Scorsese on the blowback, but I do think that the Eisner response and the Eisner impulse to immediately apologize, to regain access to the country, it comes up quite a bit. I see it cited by, free speech activists and even politicians bringing it up as one of the primary examples of an American executive agreeing and acquiescing to Chinese demands.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And obviously he wasn't the only one, because soon after, Everwood Hollywood Studio was going to China with their tail between their legs, promising all of these structural story points that would be excised from films, or willingly letting the Chinese edit films, which you hear about it pretty much every time a film opens there, whether it's a Marvel movie or, another action film. How does that work, where basically the studios provide the film and then all of a sudden there's someone in some back room editing out like references to a gay romance or something like that?
That's not far off. So when a film has finished editing and it's ready to go, it will be sent to Beijing, where a group of Communist Party censors will watch it. And they might not do the editing themselves, but oftentimes what they'll do is it can go a number of ways. They might watch the film and say, you're free to go. They might watch it with some specific requests saying, we need to tighten the shot on this frame in Green Book so it doesn't appear as though Mahershala Ali's character has been caught fooling around with another man. Or we might need to change this line of dialogue in a James Bond film because it implies that there's corruption in Macau, which is considered part of China by the authorities. And so there might be sort of, let's say, like nips and cuts there. Right. But then the other option is to say this movie's not getting in at all. There's something that there's deemed too problematic, or for whatever reason we do not want this to come out. No real memo comes from Beijing saying this is why you are not getting released in
right.
China. So it's another example of how the studios have to just kind of read the tea leaves and divine what's allowed and what's not allowed based on the feedback they get and the feedback that their peers get. It frustrates studios quite a bit because it happens very close to release, because these movies, they often are ready to screen pretty close to a release date, and sometimes the censors won't look at them until, there's like a week to go before it comes out. And when you're running a studio, one of the key things you have to press for now is to try and get a Chinese release almost as soon or as close to the American release as possible, because piracy is so rampant that if you don't get into Chinese theaters pretty quickly, a pirated copy can proliferate, within a day or so.
Interesting. Let's talk about piracy. A few weeks ago, I spoke to Bill Fay, who's one of the producers on the Hangover series, and he produced like 300 and a bunch of Roland Emmerich films. And he told me a story that his Chinese friends all have seen the Hangover movies. And he goes, that's pretty cool. He goes, no, not cool, because the Hangover movies were never shown in China. They were they were shown through pirated DVDs. But from what I understand from reading your book, didn't China then attempt to crack down on piracy to a certain extent as sort of a way to tell Hollywood, hey, we're in business with you guys?
That's right. In the 90s, piracy was the primary concern of Hollywood. No one in Hollywood was trying to get Hollywood movies into Chinese theaters because they wanted to sell a lot of tickets there. They knew they wouldn't make that much money if they did. Instead, it was to try and veer people away from the pirated options because piracy was so rampant. And there were all these stories, an executive would go over and see all of his movies for sale on the street corner. Yeah. Almost like kind of like an off-kilter blockbuster that was as you said in your interview, oftentimes with movies that were not going to be approved for release. And I think it's one thing that I would often remind people is that the Chinese audiences, I think, are far more sophisticated than oftentimes American executives will give them credit for. And it's in part because there has been, I think, far more exposure to these, let's say, quote unquote, unsanctioned films than you might otherwise expect.
Right. And so we're recording this a week into Russia's attack on the Ukraine, and we're noticing a lot of major companies and even countries sanctioning Russia, whether it's economic sanctions or a company just no longer working with Russia. How come no one's doing that with China? Is it just because of everything we've been talking about over the last 25 minutes about the fact that there's just too much money to be had that we can't do anything about it? Or does there have to be a public outcry for people to step in and do something? And I'll tie this into the Olympics. I mean, obviously, a lot of their human rights violations came to light because of the Olympics. But again, the Olympics went on. Nothing happened. The NBC happily gave the IOC billions of dollars to broadcast the Beijing Games. So when's someone going to do something?
Well, I think there's a number of things that in the dynamic here. You're right. I mean, the calls to ban films going into Russia, it's certainly been a conversation that I've been hearing. Is what about China? I think there's a couple things. One is there have been these moments, these like outbursts. I think the last one that I can think of that really broke through was whenever it was revealed that Disney had filmed a live action remake of Mulan in Xinjiang province, where there's been so much amazing reporting on the camps, the re-education camps that Uyghurs have been funneled into. When it was revealed that Disney had filmed a movie there, there was quite a bit of backlash. However, I think there's a couple dynamics at work. One that we still haven't had a moment, I think, as probably dramatic as an invasion. If we were to see something happen in Taiwan similar to what has happened between Russia and Ukraine, that could be something that breaks through to a degree where the studios are pressured enough to do something. I do think the other dynamic that's important here is that whenever these studios say we're not releasing our films in Russia, they're really losing pennies compared to the amount of money they make in a market as big as China. Russia is a massive country. Its box office is still relatively small. Its market for things like toys or consumer products is still relatively small. And very critically, it is not home to larger corporate holdings like a theme park. So the ask is a lot smaller. to say we're not working with Russia anymore. I think in the event, like if we're going to play risk here, I'd say in the event that relations between the U.S. and China devolve to a point where studios are seeing the pressure they are with Russia today, I would venture to guess that it's more likely China boots the Americans than the Americans voluntarily recede.
Oh, that's so funny. And it's funny you just talk about our display of force and power by not releasing films in Russia. It's really a move for show. It's sort of like I found interesting a lot of these musical artists that pulled their music from Spotify. And people are like, oh man, that's a great, these artists are having a stance against Spotify. But then if you look under the hood, you realize, oh, wait a minute, none of these artists are really making any money from Spotify. So it's really just a show. It's It's not really making anything happen.
I would push back on that a little bit. I mean, I think symbolic resonance can be powerful, and I do think the movies. I mean, I don't want to sound like one of these executives who makes it sound like the American movies could have caused the Arab Spring or something
right.
like that. But I do think there were thousands of Russians who had already bought tickets to see the new Warner Brothers Batman movie this weekend, and now they're not going to be able to. Is that going to cause them to revolt and riot? I don't think so, but it is going to contribute to a sense of isolation on the world stage. It might, signal a seriousness to the global response to Russia's invasion that they're not seeing in their own Russian media. But you're absolutely right. Insofar as the studios are concerned about losing money, that doesn't have to really be much of a consideration here.
And let's talk about the breakdown now in number of films that China allows from American studios. What's the number at now here in 2022?
The number is supposed to be 34 foreign films allowed into China a year. And most of those 34 tend to be American. Occasionally there's an Indian or a French or something like that, but they're usually American films. However, over the past year, that has gotten to be more uncertain than ever. And last year in particular, there are a number of theories as to why, but no real answers. China was putting a lot of walls up when it came to American releases, and a number of American big Hollywood movies did not get released in China. Movies like Black Widow, The Eternals,
wow.
Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, the first Marvel movie starring a lead Asian superhero, Spider-Man, the movie that almost single-handedly saved American theater chains. None of these films were allowed into China, and it instead gave almost free reign to the Chinese films at the box office to do very well, and also, I think, introduced a degree of uncertainty to the Hollywood studios that they had not seen for several years.
And I know you probably can't answer this, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Why is China so freaking sensitive? Because you mentioned Eternals. The reason they did not screen Eternals there was essentially because Chloe Zhao, the director of the film, had made anti-Chinese statements in the past. Why do they feel the need to lump everything together? Like, Chloe Zhao does not represent the Eternals. She's not in the film, yet they won't show that movie. Why are they so sensitive to that kind of stuff?
Well, I think that there's a dialectic in Chinese that translates roughly to kill the chicken to scare the monkeys. And it means that basically if you can make an example out of someone or something, to do so, and that oftentimes it's better if that example seems a little ridiculous, right? As you said, very few people going to the Eternals are going to be sitting there thinking about these comments that Chloe Zhao had made 8-9 years prior. But it certainly teaches everyone else a lesson not to talk about China in any disparaging way, or else they can see their career there completely disappear. And this is also coming up in political science circles at the moment now, that China's aggression and its zero tolerance policy and the blunt force with which it responds to these supposed infractions is losing far more friends than it's gaining. And that China also is needlessly suffering from the Streisand effect by creating such a hubbub around these comments. They're only ensuring that more people read the comments than ever would have.
Yeah, no, it's exactly right. Because I remember when that happened, I'm like, I didn't even know she said this, and then all of a sudden, okay, let me go back, and it's a great example of them just overreacting to something that, again, if it was the star of the film, you could kind of understand them trying to do it because it's a very symbolic and brave thing that they're taking down like this Hollywood star or something like that. But for like an independent movie director who, and most Americans who probably have no idea who that person is, it just doesn't really make any sense. But for someone people do know is John Cena. And unfortunately, your book went to print right before the whole John Cena China thing went down, right?
Actually, I don't think it did. I think my editor told me, I think we've made it clear. I think we've got enough examples of celebrities apologizing
funny.
for pissing off Chinese authorities. But it comes up a lot because this is a perfect example, right? Where John Cena, who is promoting a Fast and Furious movie that's released by Universal Pictures, a company owned by NBC Universal and owned by Comcast. So again, thinking about the larger corporate whole here, beyond the film, he was promoting, I think it was the 9th Fast and Furious film, and he made a comment in which he implied that Taiwan was its own country. And this is obviously a third rail of Chinese politics when it comes to Chinese sovereignty and what they consider their rightful borders. It created such a fuss that he had to record what appears to be a hostage video.
Oh, yeah.
In which he apologizes in Mandarin to his friends in China for making such a remark. Again, it seems like he's really overreacting to China's overreaction, but I am sure that he was advised, if you don't do this, our movie might not be released, and every movie you make might not get released. And think about the movies that John Cena makes. He's not making indies with small budgets. He's making the big summer tent poles that studios only greenlight thinking they will get into China. So his entire career could have turned a little radioactive if he hadn't hurried up and apologized. And it's why when anytime an actor or actress from the US goes to China to do press, they're sent with these binders of information saying, this is what you can discuss, this is what you should avoid, and if these topics come up, here's how to address them.
And it's funny, you said, John Cena implied, he basically said something like, it's the first country to see it. Like, it was like a throwaway line, and for some reason, boy, they're so sensitive to little. I mean, it was such a, again, to a point you made, like no one would even have picked up on it if they didn't say something. It's crazy.
Well, I mean, but like I said, everybody knows now not to say anything untoward about China's rightful borders.
And one thing people don't realize is a lot of folks think, oh, this is the government. But from my understanding is the people of China are totally drinking the Kool-Aid on this stuff. So, and they'll be the ones to rise a ruckus on their own social media talking about these sort of offenses that have been taking place. Is that weird for you as an American and someone who's written in America that like the actual people are like, yeah, that's cool that we're not going to have this movie here because this actor said this random statement?
This is really hard to parse. I mean, I know the online mobs that you're referencing, it can be really hard to know how much of that is amplified by the government,
right, true.
How much of it might originate with the government. Not to say, though, that there aren't certainly many Chinese people who are feeling a sense of patriotism, jingoism, nationalism that previous generations didn't, and that they will rush to defend their country if they want to. So I tried, and when I was reporting the book, not to discount it as only a reflection of what the government wants its people to be saying, because I think one of the reasons that it's always a mix, right? And right now in China at the box office, a lot of Chinese propaganda films about, China's victories in World War II or in the Korean War, or glory be to China because of this chapter in our history. A lot of these films are doing rather well. And part of it is because the government has controls in place to make sure they do well when they want to. But part of it is also that a lot of Chinese citizens feel like their country is meeting its moment in history or reclaiming a moment that it lost 200 years ago with the Opium Wars. And so there is, I think, a genuine fervor there to not only celebrate China, but to defend it if need be.
So what are we talking about in terms of movie making going forward? Are Hollywood studios only greenlighting now I mean, growing up, I'm sure, Eric, you remember like when a film cost $100 million, people's eyes popped out of their head. Now you're looking at these tentpole films costing $250, $300 million to make. Are Hollywood studios only making those films if they know it's got a good chance to make it to China, because otherwise they don't see them getting their money back?
Well, when a movie of that size, so we're talking $250 million just to make, and then maybe tens of millions of dollars more to market. When a movie of that size is being greenlit, the executives at the studio will get together and everyone has to go around the table and justify why they should make it and weigh the pros and cons. And they'll often say, okay, based on previous titles, we expect this movie to make X amount of dollars in the US and Canada, Y amount of dollars in the rest of the world, and Z amount of dollars in China. China is big enough to get its own column in those greenlight meetings. And oftentimes, I know this sounds crazy for movies with grosses in the 1.6, $1.7 billion range, but sometimes that China number can mean the difference between profit and loss. And if not profit and loss, then certainly not money you want to pass up. I mean, no one's running a studio as a nonprofit here.
Right.
And so that means if you're going to make a movie that's $250 million, there are ways to make a good profit on that project without China. But why would you ever put anything in the script that would risk not getting in?
Yeah, and a perfect example of this, I'm sure it's Hollywood math, but Spider-Man: No Way Home, not shown in China. If that was shown in China, I mean, it's like bringing sand to the beach. It probably would have been well over $2 billion, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Spider-Man is the example that people keep bringing up. They're saying, well, look, it made one. I mean, I don't know what it's up to now, 1.8.
Yeah, it's a 1.8. Yeah.
1.8 billion without China. And it's like, well, sure, that's great. But don't you think Sony would have liked 2.2 instead?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And do you know why Spider-Man hasn't been shown there? Did they give a petty reason for that one yet?
So, like I said, we don't know exactly why, and you rarely do. I think the leading theory on that one is that it was a massive hit. Last year, the Communist Party celebrated a major anniversary, and sometimes when these kinds of things roll around, the Chinese Communist Party like to make sure that their country looks as patriotic as possible. And a couple things that they'll do is they'll sort of tighten the spigot of Western influence. This has happened going back decades now, where anytime China wants to look as patriotic a nation as it can, it will not only try to put more nationalist projects or productions in front of Chinese eyeballs, but also make sure that its people aren't seeing Western ones.
And speaking a little closer to home, your book was published by Penguin Press, which is owned by the Penguin Group, which is owned by Bertelsmann, which is a huge media conglomerate with businesses all over the planet. Does your parent company of your book here, do they worry about Erich Schwartzel writing a book about China?
I don't think so. I mean, and actually, I would say no, because I mean, I obviously in the course of reporting this book took precautions and was as safe for myself and for my sources as possible, but never had any conversation about topics of concern or censoring or anything like that. Not at all. And I think actually my book is one of many. I mean, it feels like we're really in a bit of a boom here when it comes to books that are taking a rather unvarnished eye toward China. And I will say, as a reporter, I tried not to really, as I said, while not being naive to concerns and precautions, I really just wouldn't even allow my brain to go toward those concerns, because it felt like I would be asking myself to do what I was writing about, which was speaking in euphemism or tightening the shot to avoid nuance or, frankly, the truth.
And I'm just curious because they're big on subterfuge and spying. Did that ever come up along your reporting when you were reaching out for a contact or someone who's maybe a source? Was that in the back of your mind, or did it even come to the forward part of your brain when you were worrying about that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it has this weird effect on you, because I would go to China and I would go. Everything would be completely above board. I would apply for the visa that you apply for when you are a journalist there on a project, and certainly sneaking around or sneaking into the country.
Right.
But being there and working on a book like this can do weird things to your brain. Like you're talking to someone and your call drops out and you're like, well, do I have crappy reception in this room, or is someone listening? Or a comment's made when you're checking into the hotel and you start parsing that. And like I said, a kind of paranoia can set in a way. As I said, I think you have to be careful not to let that affect the work. And this story is in the book, but I did meet with an executive who, before we would have any conversation about China, would put their phone in a signal blocking
I love that.
bag.
And didn't they put it on the other side of the room or something like that?
And then move it to the other side of the restaurant. And then grow paranoid that wasn't far enough and that they should go put it in their car.
Wow. Amazing. And you think about it, you're talking about movies. Like, if you're talking about make-believe, and this is how people are running their lives, it's crazy. And on a personal front, and craziness, I'll tell that together, Eric, you were writing for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Energy and the Environment, and all of a sudden, you're writing for the Wall Street Journal about Hollywood, and then end up writing this amazing book about Hollywood's relationship with China. How the hell did all that happen?
Oh my God, I think it's like a case study in why journalism is the best career you could ever have, because there was no way to predict it. I mean, even going back, so I joined the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette right out of college, and I initially covered technology because I was I'll just say as kindly as possible, I started covering technology because I was the youngest reporter in the business section.
You own a mobile phone. You can write about this.
It was not that far off from that being the attitude. And then I had no interest in energy. And then I started covering the fracking boom across Appalachia, which I still think might be the best beat I'll ever have. Then started talking to the Journal, and really my only priority was going to a different city and covering a different beat. And so this was the one that came together, and then China grew from there. It really is just, I think, an example of how just sort of like following where your interests are, and also learning, because I certainly griped at times about, I don't know if I really want to cover energy. I don't know if I really want to cover Hollywood, and I don't even know if I really want to cover China. But really just a lesson in the more you learn about anything, the more you see everything can be a story. And also that timing can work out in ways you never anticipate, right? When I sold, I'm really not as anxious a person as I'm making myself sound here, but when I sold the book in 2018, I remember talking to my boyfriend and saying I felt like I was too late. I was like late to the story.
Oh, jeez.
And and now here we are, and it just feels like it's getting only timelier. So you're right. I mean, going from fracking to Hollywood and then Hollywood to China is a kind of bizarre trajectory, but you learn things with each beat that you take to each one. And like I said, it just is a matter, I think, of listening to your gut and following where you think something interesting might lead you.
Awesome. His name is Erich Schwartzel. It is a must-read. Red Carpet, Hollywood, China, and the Global Battle for Cultural Supremacy. Eric, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Hey, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
You're welcome. The pleasure was all mine. And that's it for this episode of the Forbes Books Podcast. If you enjoy the show, make sure you take a quick second to subscribe so you automatically get my new shows when they drop. Also, if you have a minute, I would love if you left us a review so more amazing entrepreneurs like yourself can discover the show. And please don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.